I was once asked to be an interim QA manager for a team that was struggling to get into Scrum and Agile. I came in, and the first thing my new boss said he wanted me to do was automate everything. Automated testing is going to cure all our problems. When I went and actually started working with the team, and we had retrospectives, and they told me what was working well and wasn't working too well, we found out that wasn't our problem at all. We didn't have good test case authoring. We did not have good scripts for deploying to environments. We were always behind development. Development was changing things on the fly and not letting us know. There was a lot of underlying problems. So I had to go back to my boss and say, that's not our problem. I want to fix these other things, because if we just automate what we're doing now, we're going to be automating a lot of junk, and that won't help anyone. So this next content is about my experience and some suggestions of things to try. The first thing I want to talk about is the flow of the sprint in Scrum, and how does QA fit into that. So I'm going to show you an instance of what happened to us. One thing we had to do, as you see in this timeline, at the sprint start and the sprint end, we had to implement close to the sprint end a code freeze. This was because we had no automated testing. It was very manual. We also had a large code base that had not been built using Agile methods, did not have good testability, and was a very intensive thing to test. So to be able to make sure things were deliverable at the end of a sprint, we had to have at least 2 days of all hands-on testing. And that was helping us get up to speed as fast as possible. Again, this might be an anti-pattern, but we had to do this because of the context we were in. But even when we implemented this, we were still having problems. So take our developers and our QA. As developers come in the sprint, they just immediately started coding on the first product backlog item A. But the testers were still working on stuff from the previous sprint because we kept folding over into the next sprint. So they weren't involved in any of the discussions. They didn't have a lot of insight into A because they're still working on catching up. So once the developer is done with A, he starts working on B. Then the tester can start writing test cases for A, but you see it's a very shortened cycle because he's already behind. When he starts actually testing A and finds a bug and has to go to the developer, that developer now has to context switch. He has to unload anything he was doing for B, get back into the mindset of A, and fix A. Meanwhile, I'm stuck while this bug is being worked on. So then we pick it up and start testing it again. The developer goes back to working on B, which is now going to take longer because he has to get back set up into that and context switch. And then we start writing our test cases for B, but of course the developer's moved on to C, always a little bit ahead of us because he's just simply writing his code and throwing it over the wall. Then when we start testing B and we find a problem, the developer has to context switch and come back and help us fix B. We continue testing B, he picks up on C, again we find a bug. It becomes apparent he's probably not going to get C done, so he has to work on B. Notice now he's actually had to work on B into the code freeze. So that point in time we were supposed to actually freeze the code can't happen because we're not done. This happened often. Then when we actually got into this code freeze date and we tested B, we're supposed to be regression testing B at this time, but now we're just simply still testing the actual functionality that was there. Then we would have to regression test A to make sure anything in B didn't break it. But that's all we got to test. We didn't get to test any upstream or downstream things that might have been affected by this code we did. Plus, what happened a couple of times is the developer got in there and went and finished C anyway, and we didn't even know it. So untested code would get released at the end of the sprint. And what happened is we were always behind. QA was always struggling. The quality of the QA we were able to do in the sprint suffered. So we started to implement things like absolute code freeze date. And the code freeze, even though it's called a code freeze, mean you need to be completely done to your definition of done. You can't be doing any extra coding or catch-up testing after that date. So code freeze was a term we used, but that's not actually what it meant. You need to be complete with the items to your definition of done. We also started limiting our work in progress. Don't move on to the next thing until the entire team or segment of the team is done with a complete product backlog item. And this is what it started looking like. So at the beginning, we still had our developer and our tester, but the first thing we did is actually start talking about how we're going to test it before we wrote a lick of code, so that the tester and the developer both understood what the outcome was going to be. They actually helped us write these tests. Soon after, they would start actually coding it, and we tested as we went along. Remember, we talked about working iteratively. So if we had a contact screen we had to do, we might get first name and last name and the validation working and saving in the database and give that to the QA person to start testing. And then we'd start working on address. working in little thin slices so that we could find things early. That way, if I found something as a tester and brought it back to you, you're still working on A. We don't have to context switch. We're right there. And that's what would happen. Then we would test together. So everybody tested in the lab, because this was a hardware company as well. And then once we were done, we moved on to B. And of course, we started by writing the test cases for B. Then, once we knew what we were going to test, the coder started actually writing B, and we tested it together. That way, if we, again, found a problem, we were right there and could fix it without having to do any context switching. We also didn't have to have a large formal process for bug tracking because they would be there testing it with us, and they would know the steps that we got to actually get to that point. And they could easily go back and fix that bug. Then when we got to our code freeze date, we would regression test A and B, but that was a very small effort. We had already done a very thorough amount of testing. It was just to make sure nothing had been broken with anything else we had done. Then we had more time, so then we could start identifying things that were upstream and downstream of these changes we made that are more likely to change, whether functionality-wise or technology-wise. So if I made a change to a calendar control, the tech leads would then tell us, this is in this component, and this component, and this component. We need to test those to make sure changes are not going to affect all these other things. So then we would test all these different elements. And at the end of the sprint, we've tested everything we did in the sprint thoroughly and done at least some targeted regression testing in front and behind those actual functionalities. And at the end of those sprints, everybody felt a lot more confident about pushing quality code into production or into beta or having it release ready. Some things we also implemented is when we did start doing automated testing, those 2 days actually cut down to 1 day. And it was, again, just because we were hardware, we had a degree of manual testing that had to be in there. I can see if you were web-based and you didn't have that need for as much hardware testing, you could even cut that out entirely if you got into a pattern. The thing was, we tested together, we reviewed the test together, we started with the test, so it was almost like acceptance test-driven design. And we have implemented this at multiple clients, and every time we've met resistance, but eventually everybody comes on board and says, this is helping us make a much better quality product than we ever have had before. And even though we might only be getting a smaller amount in the actual sprints done, it's fully tested, and we don't have to support that as much outside the sprints with production support because it's better quality. I now want to bring up some best practices we implemented in QA in a list that you can kind of follow along. These worked for us. They may not work for you, but they're pretty high level, and you may follow them and implement something different in the spirit of these in your own environment. One of the first things we did was target hiring quality engineers, people who actually had some engineering background and a quality assurance capabilities. That way, when we started doing automated tests, whether they were integration tests or automated feature tests, they understood those technologies. The ones who didn't, we sent to training to learn C# or whatever tools they needed to be able to help with automation. That way, the developers and the QA could help out with our automation suites together. That helped us create much wider tests and code coverage. And there was also a better understanding between our engineering people and developers and our QA people. We also did what we talked about before. QA and dev sat together. This was hard at first. We had a QA manager who really wanted all her QA people sitting in front of her so she could see them. But again, we had to talk about they interact with their developers on a day-to-day basis. Every now and then you have some meetings where you get some status updates or talk about best practices. They need to be with the people they work with day-to-day. So we put QA together, and on my team, I started actually alternating. I put QA people in one cube and developers in another cube. That way, if I had to go talk to another developer, I had to pass by all the QA people to get there. And if we started discussing something that had impact on them, they were there to hear it and join in the conversation if we forgot to invite them. We also made sure that QA was involved in analysis and design. A lot of times these meetings were done in absentia of QA representation. So we'd go and talk about design without them. And sometimes we decided to split screens up or do something a different way that had effect on their test, but they weren't alerted until late in the cycle. Bring them into this meeting so they hear it right then and there and can work on their tests with that knowledge. When we started doing grooming and things like that with product backlogs, QA always had to be represented there as well, so they understand the functionality as well as anybody else on the team. It was critical that we all had the same level of domain knowledge. We also tested as we went. This is that iterative thing we were just talking about. Don't wait until the last second. That will always create a burden on QA to try to get this done in the wee hours of the morning before the sprint end. And that's never going to result in good quality. We also made testing as part of our definition of done. You couldn't say you were done and move on to the next thing until testing had been actually completed on a production-like environment and all our tests were passing or with an acceptable bug that the product owner had approved. These things made it where we limited our work in progress. Developers couldn't go pick up the next thing until the team had progressed forward to their definition of done. So I brought this up before. Limit your work in progress. Don't tackle too many things at once. Doesn't mean you have to be single-threaded and only work on one thing, but don't have too many things open, because all that will do is mean that you have too many things at the end of the sprint that don't get all the way done. Your team will figure out what the best work in progress limit is for them and then stick to it. If there is an actual time when you need to break it, that's okay. This is a soft threshold. Just have a discussion as a team, and if you decide it won't create any downstream effect for somebody else that's negative, go ahead and do it. Everyone can help test. This was very important. There was a lot of resistance on both sides. A lot of developers would say, I don't want to go and test. I don't know how to test. Like, that's okay. QA helped them learn how to test, educated them on the tools. They were running the test cases that QA had approved. And sometimes I would meet resistance from QA themselves. They didn't want testers coming in and testing their own code. That's fine. Switch them on other code. Even if they do have to test their own code, they're running QA's test cases, not test cases they came up with themselves. So they can't do any kind of assumptions or inference that they know because they wrote it. If they follow the test cases that you've laid out for them, then it's an acceptable path. Often I would get pushback from developers who would say, well, do you want to waste somebody of my caliber and my rate, my high influential rate, to work on this? I'd often respond, how are you sure I'm not paying QA the same as you? I find that QA is just as valuable as any developer I have. Frequent and incremental releases for feedback. So making sure at the end of each sprint we actually delivered this was great, because we would be able to go to beta programs, put this at a client, and get feedback of things we never even thought of in our testing. And the customer was finding new and creative ways to break stuff. And although that might be seen in some places as a bad thing, we saw it as a great thing, because we got it to them soon enough that when they found these breaks, we could address them and fix them before an actual release. And we were very responsive, very active, and our clients actually loved it, where before there was a lot of trepidation about putting code that might not be what they see as fully developed. But we made sure they had open lines of communication and communicate with us directly when there's any problem. We were very responsive, and we actually got clients who preferred that way over the old way of waiting 6 months before they got a release. We also set bug queue limits. An acceptable amount of bugs that once we reached it, we stopped everything and fixed those bugs. Now, some will say this is an standard pattern, you want to fix every bug you get, but there are going to be bugs that escape. And if a bug escapes, sometimes there is a legitimate reason to say, I don't want to fix that. This is such a low priority bug, or it's a very edge case, or it only happened with this one client, we have a very known workaround. There's sometimes when it's acceptable to let that go out. But we set these limits because sometimes you may have tons of little things that individually are acceptable, but you put them all together and you have a poor quality product. By setting these bug limits and constantly monitoring, and know that once we reach that threshold, we stopped everything, fixed all those bugs, got it back down to 0, and then started working on features again. Forced us to make sure we baked quality in from day one. Let's talk about dealing with bugs. Bugs are going to happen. When people talk about we want to have 0 defect, that's great, really hard to achieve. But we want to talk about how we deal with bugs inside the sprint and bugs outside the sprint, because it's a little bit different. So when you have a developer and a tester working inside the sprint, hopefully that developer is working on individual pieces. So let's say he's working on a wizard and he's written one of the screens of these 3 screens. Go ahead, and when you get that screen done, give it to your QA person and they can start working on it. So that QA person finds a bug in it. Now, if they're operating in the old school way, they might write up a bug report or a defect report and send that to the developer. And then they might start putting in all sorts of bugs and flooding the developer with all these bug reports. That way, you're guaranteeing that developer's not going to send you little pieces anymore. He's going to wait till everything's perfect, especially in the attitude and how this is done. If it's an us versus them, hey, there's a bug in your code, you're writing crappy code, then there's going to be this negative effect, and people aren't going to want to work collaboratively. I was once working with a QA person in a Scrum environment, but he had never worked in a Scrum environment before. And he had the idea that he got paid by the bug. So we were working on something, and it was a menu. And it was a repeated piece of code. So the menu repeated itself several times, exact same piece of code. There was a bug in it. He logged the bug, I saw it come in, and I sent him a note saying, hey, this isn't a repeated piece of code. You're going to see an error multiple times, but we'll fix it once and it should fix everything. I started working on it, and suddenly I got 9 more bug reports of each menu failing. I once again told him, you know, this is the same bug. You don't have to report it multiple times. Then I started working on it. I get a couple of more bug reports, and I finally had to go in and say, are you having a quota that you have to meet? Are you getting paid by the bug? And that's just how sometimes they feel, that that's my value, is I find bugs in your code. But that's more quality control. Quality assurance is making sure they don't happen at all. So coming and talking to me and dealing directly with me and having an individual interaction with me and not just throwing things over the wall, and also the attitude in which you do it. And understanding that once I told you we have identified this bug, you don't have to keep logging it. That was just creating an us versus them attitude, and it became very hard to deal with them. So you want to make sure that both QA and dev work together and understanding that you both have quality as your #1 goal. It's just in your title, but everybody's working towards it. So let's take what I just talked about and put it in the same scenario we were just going through. I have a developer. He's working on a 4-page wizard. He's going to give me, as a tester, the first page. I find a bug. I go and actually talk to him, and I say, I found this. What do you think it is? Because it might be that he hasn't written that code yet. It may not even be a bug. But let's say we do find it is a bug. But instead of logging a bug, I'm actually going to create a task and put it on my sprint backlog item. That way, I've identified that it needs to be fixed, and I'm going to give that to the developer, and then I'm going to make sure that in my test, I write something to make sure that bug doesn't escape. That's enough coverage. The developer knows what he needs to do to fix the bug. I have something that's going to make sure that bug doesn't escape. We don't really need to log something at a time. That helps us because if we log that as a bug and then fix it inside the sprint, it's still in the defect system. And sometimes what will happen is people will look at the defect count and say, why, you have a really big defect count. But a lot of those things are things we're addressing and fixing inside the sprint. And that's just the sausage being made. That's a different metric. So if you are going to log those in some type of system, have some flag to say, this is something I resolved inside the sprint, and this is something that actually escaped, because it's different. And if we deal with this in a more informal way, but still tracking it, it creates less of a us versus them between QA and development. And you're going to see them work better towards a quality product as a team. But we do know that in our final product, there are probably going to be some bugs that escape. And how are we going to treat those? First of all, if it's a critical bug, we find something that is a total outage or is charging the customer incorrectly, this is something we have to fix immediately. Well, then we have to fix that immediately. You can't not fix it. So what you want to do is make an intelligent decision. Get the team, get some kind of basic estimate around it, some investigation, and then decide how big it is so that you can decide what you're going to move off the sprint. You want to make sure you don't just cram all the bugs in there and still expect everybody to work on everything else they committed to. We're trying to keep up a sustainable pace, and if we are not tracking these bugs and adequately removing the same amount of effort, we're trying to do something more than we've ever proven we can do. And that's okay that you bring critical bugs in, but make sure you understand something has to move out when that happens. If it's not a critical bug and it can wait until a later sprint to be fixed, then just simply put it on the backlog and prioritize with everything else. Whether it'll be in the next sprint we do it or in 3 sprints from now, who knows? But just simply treat it as another product backlog item. Another thing that will happen is enhancements will come in disguised as bugs. We'll put something out there and we did it exactly the way we thought, but then when the customer uses it, they don't like it that way and they say, I don't usually do it in this way. I do A, B, C, and you've written D, E, F. And I've seen sometimes that comes back from the field as a bug. And it's not a bug, it's just a new product backlog item that we need to put in there for this enhancement or this change. But if you put it in there as a bug, again, it's going to show up on bug counts and charts and all these reports, and we're going to get beat up about it. And that's not really fair to the development team or the QA team, because we did exactly what we thought. We have to understand that enhancements are part of embracing change, and they're not bugs. Then if you start classifying everything in these ways, it's very easy to determine how you're going to deal with them. Critical bug, deal with it in the sprint, move out the same equal size of effort. Non-critical bug, just treat it like a product backlog item, groom it and prioritize it on your product backlog. Enhancements, make sure they're identified as new user stories, put them on the backlog just like everything else.